So, namaste, greetings to all of you from different parts of the world. I'm so glad to have today Shannon Wills from Denver, Colorado at present. She is from Irish uh, ancestry and a very deeply connected person uh, in terms of culturally as well as spiritually with humanity as a project which she calls as Wake Human Project. So she's an author, an artist, and founder of the Wake Human Project. She started off as a veterinarian primarily because she thought of standing up against the objectification of animals as well as objectification of nature. And that led her to explore deeper into psychology. So that was her realm of study. And from there on, she's really progressed and widened her canvas through the Wake Up Human Project. And from that vantage point, she could palpably connect with the thought shared by a Native American indigenous leader in a Native American month event in Colorado, where she very spontaneously and in a very deeper simplicity said, "We are all indigenous." And that set Shannon thinking. And she came up with a beautiful evocative story by the same title, "We Are All Indigenous." And that is where I could find that article and then connect with her. It's been over a month since we've been corresponding, and such a pleasure to finally have this session of the We Are All Indigenous webinar series. Along with Shannon, we have Lindelwa Nxele, who's a young indigenous leader and activist from South Africa. I'm thankful to our good friend Maseko Menzi from the Institute of Africology for connecting Lindelwa to us to this session. We have from deep down in South Asia, Sri Lanka, which has been very much in the news in the recent past for various reasons. Feisal Mansoor, who is a deep humanist. He is founder of the Saradial Party, which believes in grassroots level democracy, and they conduct capacity building programs for grassroots leadership based on principles of Mahasammat and Gram Swaraj. So such a pleasure to have my long time associate, very supportive thought partner, Darryl D'Souza, who has again an amazing story. So we are all connected by this common theme. He has been a design engineer, and at the top of his career, there's a coincidence that he gets an infection from a stream water with some contamination, which he didn't anticipate, and that leads to an autoimmune disorder which escalates and troubles him for a long 13 to 14 years. And that's a very deeply exploration into the realms of how allopathy and homeopathy and modern medical systems work. And finally, he lands with integrative medicine. He not only cures himself within an year, but as Darryl would share further, he also decides to quit his mega city lifestyle and job and come back to his ancestral home in Goa and start afresh. And as he likes to share in a very inspiring way, that in no time he could not only get a livelihood, by doing organic farming and integrative medicine practices, connecting with the local community. He is now a global thought leader and founder of Earth Keepers Connect. There are more people that I'm expecting on this program to interact with Shannon. Dr. Mark Trozzi, he's a co-founder of World Council for Health, and another very supportive and very powerful resonance that Dr. Trozzi and I have on various issues, including We Are All Indigenous theme, right from the first General Assembly of World Council for Health that I attended in January. Then there is Kim Knight from New Zealand, who is originally of British ancestry, and she has been a spiritual explorer with gurus from across the world, from China to Japan to India. And with her repertoire of spiritual knowledge, she is founder of Art of Health. We already had her in one of the earlier sessions of the We Are All Indigenous webinar series. Along with her, we had one of the world's most powerful proponent of what's called People's Treaty, vis-a-vis the cabal, or let's say the the capitalists' selfish-driven treaty, which is called the WHO, World Health Organization's Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response Treaty. So James Roguski is a lawyer based out of Los Angeles. This being the profile of people who've been associated with the We Are All Indigenous webinar series so far. This is 5th in the series. And in this, as I've shared in the chat box and also in the agenda note, the structure is that it's in 4 parts. In the first part, the subtopic is the yin and yang of being indigenous. So the yin being the softer component of what being indigenous truly means. So the identity, the spirit of being indigenous, the spirit of being in harmony with Mother Nature, the spirit of feeling that all human beings, as well as all animals and plants, we are all coexisting and in a way deeply interconnected at a spiritual level. So that's the yin side. And the yang side, as I like to highlight, is about the harder structures, the habitats, the forms that we create, that in a way, as we say, form follows function, but also there is a causal loop of functions also follow the form over time. So the hard side, the yang side of being indigenous, how the non-indigenous systems and structures have not only encroached and trespassed and transgressed upon the spaces, the commons of the indigenous ways of life, which has kind of disrupted, damaged, and depleted support systems for indigenous communities to live in health and harmony, peace and prosperity. And then they are called as poor, they are called as underdeveloped, then they are called as the global south. So this is the backstory of the yin and yang. So the second part is about reclaiming the indigenous as the soul of humanity. And in this, we are exploring what kind of mass formation is needed from people who share this ethos in the letter and spirit of the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People and the UN fact sheet, which mentions that being indigenous is a matter of self-identification prima facie, before it talks about some other conflicting and contradictory indications of being indigenous, as we will delve upon later in the conversation. So that's the second part, reclaiming the indigenous as the soul of humanity. So is non-indigenous in that respect dehumanizing and despiritualizing, something that resonates with the thought thinking aloud from the Club of Rome, the limits to growth, from Wolfgang Sachs, the archaeology of development idea, and so much work, the Silent Spring and the Rio Summit, the declarations of a universal declaration for rights of Mother Earth that was passed unanimously at Cochabamba, Bolivia in 2010 by the World People's Conference on Climate Change and Ecology. So all this put together brings us to a stage where we need to reclaim the indigenous, not just for who people who are pinpointed or identified as indigenous tribes at a local level, but indigenous as a global concept of being the classical and cosmopolitan global indigenous, which was completely displaced and usurped by the Euro-Western universalism, which we all realize has become some kind of a fanatic cult. And in its, as Oswald Spengler talked about at the, the decline of the West in the aftermath of the First World War, in its death pangs as the Faustian culture, a culture which has sold its soul to the devil. So that's the second part. In the third part, we explore an even more thought-provoking topic, which is that Global North, in their own definition, had their say over the last couple of centuries, and when it was defined after the Second World War as through the Bretton Woods instruments and the UN systems and structures, which is so beautifully presented recently by a UN WHO insider, Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger from Austria. So that put together, if Global North has a certain pathways which limits it or constricts it to a certain way of thinking, to a certain level of thinking, can the Global South, which is represented by Feisal Mansoor here, by Lindelwa, Nxele, and everyone, because in the definition of the Global North and Global South, it is categorically said that it's not about the geography, it's about the mindset that is fixated on a certain notion of development. So if that notion of development is found out to be fatally flawed, then are people willing to switch sides from the Global North to the Global South, irrespective of which geographical location they might belong to? So that's what we are calling as tectonic shifts in the Global South. And I relate it to the tectonic shifts of Pangaea that led to the formation of Himalayas when the Indian landmass comes at a speed which is 4 times at 20 centimeters per year speed of tectonic plates movement and hits the Eurasian, and that love affair creates the Himalayan orogeny. So that's something I set as a metaphor for the new tectonic shifts that might happen in the Global South as a way of thinking, as a metaphor to create a new world order which is healthy, harmonious, peaceful, and prosperous. So with this backdrop and the session structure, and the fourth part is about question and answers from all the participants who are present right now and who might join in later. So with this, I start off with Shannon. I'd like to invite you, and once again, thank you so much from deep down for all that represent humanity and its soul, to share your story and to walk us through as to how what led you to believe that we are all indigenous in the first place, and how do you see the yin and yang of indigenous balancing out in the present times as well as in the times to come.
Thank you so much, Chandra. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm honestly humbled to be here among people who have so much experience on their own accord. And I'm hopeful that I can share something that will be of benefit to the conversation from my perspective, and also very much look forward to learning from all of you throughout this conversation. I would love to know your perspectives on my own work and also hear more about what you all are doing. This is a global conversation and it's very important, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. So I think what I would like to do, as Chandra alluded to, I'd love to give a bit of my background, and that includes my story. This is my personal story and how I've sort of developed my ideas and come to where I am, and also a bit about my identity within the cultural complex that I live in. I think that's very important when I talk about being Indigenous. So, and then after that, we can take the conversation whichever direction we want it to flow. And I hope I can be of service. So about my past. So as Chandra mentioned, my path, so to speak, began really when I was a teenager. And I was what I would say a young animal rights activist. I looked around me and I saw especially factory farming, but I also saw testing on animals, experimentation on animals, and the fur trade and various other trades that do recognize that animals are objects for us to use. And this was so disheartening and heartbreaking to me. And I wanted to be helpful. So in addition to signing on to various sort of animal rights activist types of projects, I also wanted to be able to be what I felt was a legitimate voice for raising consciousness around the rights and the beingness of animals. And so I started by going to veterinary school. Out of high school, I started learning the veterinary trade. And about 2 years in, I got my associate's degree. And while I continued my studies, I started working in the animal shelter industry, which is where we have homeless animals who don't have a home, and we attempt to find homes for them. And in the process of working there, I had a very hard time, because what I saw in that sad situation was so many people still looking at animals as objects to an extreme extent. And we were having to euthanize animals that didn't have homes because people were dropping them off because the dog didn't match their carpet, or they decided they wanted a new one. So somebody would, I don't want to get into that too deeply, but people would come and ask, can we exchange this if we don't like it, as though it was a t-shirt. And I just saw a lot of death at the hands of human choices. And I was heartbroken, and I was having nightmares, and it was starting to affect me in such that I started having a very negative view of humanity. And in my mind then, in my early 20s, I felt like I hated people. I hated people. I didn't want to be around people. I was so angry. And I can feel the emotion of that even now. And it resulted in me leaving the profession because I didn't want to hate people, and I didn't want to hurt myself anymore. And in the process of that leaving is when I first began looking into spiritual study, because I realized how angry I was. I realized how angry I was at how I saw the world operating and the anger I had internalized around that. And it was very fortunate. I came upon some books from the Buddhist tradition, and I began studying a bit of Buddhism. I also began studying some other spiritual traditions as well, which has continued on throughout my path, this exploration of spiritual traditions. And at that time, I was so deeply helped by leaning into spirit and into spiritual teachings that showed me that the pain that we enact upon the world, whether it's upon the animals, whether it's upon the forest or nature, whether it's the pain that we enact upon one another in our conflicts, large and small, and then the pain that we suffer internally and that we impose upon ourselves, that so much of that is psychological, and it's also spiritual. It's very spiritual, but it's also psychological. And looking at it in these Western sort of scientific terms, I wanted to know, if I truly want to help, I recognize that the objectification is the problem, but this spiritual sickness and the psychological sickness is the deeper root of that problem. So this is where I chose to shift career directions and become involved in study of psychology. So psychology is something that then I studied, I completed my degree in, and a large segment of that study was related to cross-cultural psychology and cross-cultural conflict resolution. And I went and studied I was in Central America, chiefly Guatemala, on and off for about 2 years. And I completed an independent study in cross-cultural conflict resolution. What that really showed me was the ways that the narratives that our cultures impose upon us, again, or that our cultures teach us. Narratives aren't all bad, they can be very good, but the ways that narratives affect our ways of viewing what is valuable. And particularly in Guatemala, I spent time with what would be called the indigenous people there, the Mayan people of Guatemala. I also spent time in the communities of the Ladino people, which are the people who have been westernized, Spanish speaking, often have European ancestral roots mixed in perhaps with more native roots. And I could see, I experienced the different worldviews of those two sides, and they're not cut and dry. But there's a clear difference between spending time in the communities of the indigenous Guatemalan people and in the communities of the Ladino or the westernized or European rooted Guatemalan people. So that just led me to this understanding that it's not just a psychological or a spiritual complex that we are working within when we're wanting to shift cultural perspectives. It's also cultural. It's very cultural. So back in the US, on the heels of my work in conflict resolution and psychology, this is when I finally became involved in something that helped me to begin to fuse the various interests that I had been pursuing. And that was, I was invited to participate in working as the executive director for the Meta Center for Nonviolence. The nonviolence, the way that the Meta Center teaches it, was in Berkeley, California. This was very much in the tradition of Gandhiji, and also of Martin Luther King Jr. here in the US, the tradition of nonviolence, which is rooted in not just activism, but also in spirit and in spiritual tradition, and the understanding of conflict resolution or nonviolent strategy as a practice, not of winning over an enemy, but of rehumanizing a relationship. So recognizing the opponent, if we have an opponent, we recognize that opponent as a humanity, and we appeal to their humanity. And as some of you may know, that practice goes very, very deep, and it is not easy. And Gandhi and Martin Luther King were very powerful activists, and they were also very powerfully spiritual people. And so, and there's very, very, very much a psychology to what they do. And so I found in nonviolence a fusing of the psychology, of activism, of spirituality, of social justice, and it still informs my work today. So when I come to talk about my work with We Are All Indigenous, the article that I wrote, Wake Up Human, it's coming from this background and also from this understanding that nonviolence has imbued in me, which is that all of these different paths are connected and necessary if we want to see a change, if we want to create change. So thank you for listening to that bit of background. I do want to add a bit about my identity within my own culture. I think this is very important as an American, as a white American right now, and you may understand why when I say what I'm going to say. So in my country, I'm an American born in the West of America. And I'm an American woman. I'm a white-skinned person in this country. I'm a person of European ancestry. And what that means as a white-skinned person of European ancestry, that means that I descended from settler colonialists who were not originally indigenous to this particular land that we now call North America. But my ancestry is rooted in the lands of Europe, where there are indigenous traditions going back millennia. Mostly my ancestors come from the British Isles. So I don't know who any of my ancestors, I know a few of who my ancestors were, but not many. But I do know that they were part of the centuries of waves of immigrants that came to this land starting in the 1600s. I know I had at least one ancestor who came over on the Mayflower, and that was in 1620. So since then, there have been, as I imagine you are all very aware, there have been many waves of immigration from Europe and elsewhere that have displaced and oppressed the native population of this country in some truly horrific ways that our country still has not recovered from. And the immigrant waves of my ancestors are the waves of people who enslaved peoples of Africa and elsewhere. And for centuries we have suffered the repercussions of the cruelty that was enacted on Native Americans and Africans and others. And the result is that now I'm living on these lands, this beautiful land, Colorado, that was once the homeland of natives to this land who no longer are able to live here because of the depth of the colonialism, of the depth of the effect of the colonialism that has happened over centuries. So right now in this country, it's a very important conversation around how do we recognize the losses of the indigenous people of this country? Is there any way that we can make reparations to them for what has been lost? In some way, there's no possible way to make reparations for what has been lost to them through colonialism. And yet, people like me, who very much want to participate in the healing conversations in this country, we have to ask these questions about which words we use, which identities we take on. And so there is a hesitancy, or I would say a confusion in this country. I can only speak for my own self, but I do believe there's a hesitancy among European Americans to really delve into this question of using the words indigenous, because we do not want to step on the traditions of the Native Americans of this country. So there's also an understanding of among Euro-Americans in this country that we are not on our native lands. We are actually also disconnected from our native lands, just as the indigenous people of this country have been disconnected from their native lands. Also, I, as a European American, am disconnected from my native lands. My native lands are on the other side of an ocean. I don't know the traditions of my ancestral people. And so here we are as a disconnected people trying to work for reconnection and trying to support and honor the disconnection that the Native Americans have suffered. And yet we're in a similar boat, I would say, suffering from the cutting of our roots. So what is happening, what tends to happen, and this is common, I want to say, in this country, is that those of us who recognize that our roots have been cut, we don't know how to reconnect our roots. We don't even know sometimes what they are. And so we want to have, but we recognize something is missing. We recognize that we're disconnected. And so one of the ways that we do it, like I did when I was so angry and I found the Buddhist tradition, I began studying the Buddhist tradition. And this is a very common thing to do in the US, because we'll find ourselves deeply in need of some type of spiritual sustenance, and we can't find it here. And it makes sense because of the modernist, capitalist, materialist culture that we're living in already, and then the fact that we've been disconnected from our ancestral homes and from our known. It has been common in some time Americans to learn from them and to take on some teaching or some learning or participate in those traditions of the Native Americans, because we realize how beautiful they are. We see the Native Americans and we see they're still connected to something that we've lost. However disconnected they may be as the result of centuries of settler colonialism, yet they are still connected to the cycles of nature. They're still connected to the conversation with all non-human beings as well as the human beings. And we see that and we want it. And then we want to, there's a danger, because then there's a danger of co-opting that and saying, I'm going to take their tradition on to myself because I see how rich it is. I want to learn from it. The issue with that is that then that can be, there can be a fine line between appreciating that culture and then appropriating that culture. And appreciating that culture is beautiful. We can learn from it. We can aspire to it. But appropriating that culture, as a white woman from Europe, if I appropriate that culture and I say, oh, this looks like a great culture, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to start doing Native American practices as my indigenous tradition. That is perpetuating the very colonialist mindset and damaging co-optation of culture that is part of the problem. So what to do as a white American in the United States? You know, I'm not going to go back to, Ireland's not going to take me back. You know, Ireland's full. We can't go back to our ancestral lands, and we need to find a way forward with all of the other people. This is a multicultural country, so many people from so many countries. We need to find our respectful place on this land. And if we believe that we are indigenous to this earth, which I believe we are, and we'll be talking about this, and we feel it in our bones that we want to belong and that we come from here, then we need to be brave enough within this culture of, you know, tiptoeing, being fearful, not to disrespect, not to co-opt. We need to be brave enough to be willing to talk about this term indigenous and what it means to call ourselves indigenous. So this whole theme is what informs my article entitled We Are All Indigenous, which is how you found me, Chandra. And the article is connected with all of these themes, but it's not about these themes. So I'd like to just share a little bit about what the article is about and what the key insights are that came from that article. So the article I wrote the day after an experience that I had that deeply informed me about how I want to show up around this term indigenous. So as I mentioned, I have studied various spiritual traditions for several decades now. I've been studying with various teachers, and I have a teacher I love and admire deeply. He's a Qigong master, a Tai Chi master, and I've been studying, I was studying Qigong and meditation with him at the time that this happened. So Taoism, as some of you may be well aware, is an indigenous tradition out of China. It goes back millennia, and it is rooted in the types of animist and earth-loving philosophies indigenous cultures are rooted in. And so they recognize within this tradition the universality of the earth-loving traditions within indigenous traditions, however they may manifest. It might be Taoism in China, it might be Native Americans in the United States. And so as part of this, the meditation for that evening, the Taoist teacher gave or invited a group of Native Americans to come to our meditation, our Taoist meditation gathering. And when they came, we were in, for whatever reason, they turned off all the lights. And the indigenous, there was a group of indigenous Native American dancers, and they came into the room and they gave a presentation and a dance. I described this in the article. And out of the corner of the room, a woman speaks, a Native American woman, and she gives a lovely statement about all of us coming from the same mother, about all of us needing to recognize that we come from the same mother, and about all of us being indigenous to this earth. And she says it again and again. We are all indigenous. We are all indigenous. We are all indigenous. And at the end of her talk, she says, will you join me? Will you join me? And something broke loose in me when I heard her say that. It's like I needed permission. This woman who's a native to this country, had I gone to her and said, oh, we're all indigenous to this planet, it would have felt like a total disrespect based on the cultural conditioning I have around this term. But I didn't say it to her, she said it to us. And when she said that, I felt a permission, I felt an understanding. Like, the indigenous people of this country and of all countries need people like me to be willing to join with them in the conversation of all life, in the earth honoring conversation. And however much baggage might come with the word indigenous in this country, I became willing to not worry about that baggage and just say, look, if my heart really wants to do the work of reconnection and reparation, then I need to be willing to do what this woman is asking. And it's not just her. This is something I have heard from other indigenous people that, I actually heard this comment a couple of years ago in a talk I was listening to, and there were people of, we would say people of color in this country, or Black and brown people, as they would say in this country. And they were saying, how can white people want to know how they can participate, in the healing of the racial divides and the cultural divides in this country. And one of them said, and it was a Black man, and then the woman was from oh shoot, I can't remember her background, but they were saying to each other, you know what, white people need to figure that out for themselves. We've got enough to do. We've got enough work to do. And that really struck me. And I was like, oh, you know what, I'm one of those white people that needs to help contribute to figuring this out. You know, I'm not willing to continue to be the descendant of settler colonialists without asking what that means and what has been lost and what can be regained. So the question of what has been lost and what has can be regained, what needs to be regained, that is actually what is at the root of my project, Wake Up Human. So just before I jump to that though, I do want to say, you know, so the key insight of that article for me, there were a couple of key insights. One of them was that while people in our culture may be hesitant to say, to embrace this term that we are all indigenous, yet it is true. Yet it is true. Whether we want to embrace it or not, we are all indigenous to this planet. And the connected insight there, which may not be as apparent, is that to the extent that we are willing to call ourselves indigenous to the planet, we are recognizing ourselves as children of Mother Earth, and we are owning the responsibility for what that means. So it's a powerful act to take on that responsibility and say, I'm going to recognize myself as one part of a much greater whole, which is not what we are taught in this country. We're taught that we're individual, that we make or break ourselves by our hard work, that our value lies in our work and it is proved by our success and our money. This is very different than taking on a responsibility of being one drop in an ocean and doing your part for the ocean rather than doing your part for your own one bit of success. So the article that I wrote has gotten a lot of positive feedback from people like me, friends I have who also have indigenous roots in Europe, recognizing that it's a juicy conversation, like we would say. It's a juicy conversation. There's a lot to extract from this conversation. And I've gotten more feedback on this theme of we are all indigenous. And also another thing I like to say is we are all indigenous to somewhere. So even if you don't want to say you're indigenous to this country, even if that's too much, too tender, you are indigenous to somewhere. There's no question about that. You didn't come from Mars. You're indigenous to somewhere, and people are resonating with that. So that what that's telling me is that this is resonating within the hearts of people. It's a theme to continue exploring, but because I'm finding it's a place I can be of service. So, and it's also part of my personal healing because I'm still exploring this question. So Wake Up Human then is, and this is the last thing I'll say. I just want to give a bit of background about that. So Wake Up Human is a new project. I've built this up over the last 2 years or so with some of my writing, and then I've got a podcast that I've started, which is the main place that I'm sharing conversations around this theme. But the theme really is related to everything I've just been talking about. It's this idea or this understanding that so many of us have lost our native connections to life and earth, and that we are, not only are we suffering personally from that, but we are suffering in our relationships, we are causing other beings to suffer, and we're killing the planet. We're killing the planet. If human beings were not taking on this ethos of separation, or this ethos of humanity being somehow above and transcendent and independent of the rest of life, if we did not have this mechanistic worldview, we would not be able to destroy the planet the way that we are. We would not be able to raise animals in factory farms, going back to the very beginning. There's no way that we could or would do that. We would recognize that the pain of those beings is our own pain. We would recognize that when we destroy the country or the planet, we're destroying ourselves, which is clearly true. Even if you just want to be a scientist and look at the science of it and not even touch the spirit of it, it's clearly true. So it is insane what we're doing. It's madness what we're doing. So Wake Up Human is just my attempt to contribute to this conversation that's saying, let's look at where we have separated from the great conversation of life. Let's mourn what has been lost. Let's recognize what has been lost. And then let's look at practical ways that we can come back into reconnection for our own sakes, for our relationships, and for our planet. So, our planet just so desperately needs it. And I recognize myself as one voice, one drop in the ocean, but it feels really good to do this work because it feels like the work my soul has been calling me to do all these years and all these experiences. And it is in a moment like this where I recognize how incredibly important it is, because if I do my work and each one of you is doing your work from where you are, from your cultural backgrounds, from your life experiences, we can inspire one another. But it's not just about inspiring one another. It's like this conversation needs to get bigger. So whatever I can do to contribute my part is what I'm here for. So, you asked me to, Chandra, you asked me to comment on yin and yang of being indigenous, and I'm happy to do that, but I thought I would just stop for a moment because that was quite a bit. And I'd love to just make space for any comments from you or anyone before I just continue talking. So thank you all so much for your kind attention and for holding space for this story. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much, Shannon. So before I come to my question, I'd like to invite all the fellow speakers, Feisal, Darryl, and Lindelwa, on how do you resonate with the narrative and the the being indigenous perspective that Shannon shares. How realistic do you see that if a white American woman is brave enough to spell out and not mince her words that we are all indigenous, then what's stopping the rest of humanity, including billions of people in India and China who have stuck to their indigenous roots in some fashion or the other? So anyone who would like to start? Or okay, so I think we'll carry on further. So yeah,
I was hoping that Darryl will take the ball, but since he dropped the ball, I'll respond. Well, basically, there's nothing that I disagree with at all with anything that Shannon talked about, and but there's an aspect of it that we kind of function from, which is the basis of ahimsa, or of non-violence as she called it. And it comes from our understanding of our cultural understanding that the purpose, if there is a purpose to life, the only one that we as human beings can discern, unique from any other investigation, is ourselves. If every experience that we have can at best be conveyed third hand. So what we are searching, so in all traditional cultures, and all traditional worldviews proceed to give the human being or the being in that paradigm the ability to discover themselves. So everything in society exists. You know, we grew up in this mechanized idea, and I'm afraid sort of the Western rehash of knowledge after Dark Ages, which in the process of doing so created this mechanical industrial monster, which is consuming all our children right now. So we lost our connections with what the Arabs call the wakuf. So all common law in Europe comes from the wakuf, from the Spanish, the Moors in Spain, creating the common law in Spain, and the wakuf, which is the idea that society exists for the benefit of society. The word wakuf means basically social wealth. So it all belongs to each other. So this is a generalized, right across the board. We have every society of man, traditional society of man, we have this idea that society exists not simply for the purpose of safety in numbers, but society exists in order to afford each individual in society the best chance of self-discovery. Now, as a Buddhist, you will know that in the Buddhist tradition, we have the Dhamma. So in Sri Lanka, the king was by the authenticity of his reign, that he was observing and demonstrating to the rest of the country the Dasaraja Dhamma, because the whole key in that is that since everybody has the potential, with Dasaraja Dhamma means the royal virtues, right? So everybody is trying to become the king, because they want to become Dharmaraja, they want to understand Dhamma, they want to understand truth. So everybody is potentially Dharmaraja. Just as Buddha himself is called Satchanama, he whose name is truth. So it's not only Buddhism that says that that when one understands truth, one becomes truth. All indigenous traditions, all traditional knowledge around the world says exactly the same thing, because there is only one reality, and that is that every tradition directs you to self-discovery. So, but however, crucial in the self-discovery is this idea of ahimsa, because in your self-discovery, you must not interfere with anybody else's self-discovery, which would be to affect them adversely. So that is where ahimsa comes from. Himsa, and himsa comes from the ability not to hurt. So you do whatever you want. You know, you dance, you sing, you do whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt any other living being, not just human beings, but all beings. Everything has a right to exist. However, you realize that that life itself is a transformative purpose, and life proceeds by consuming life. That we observe that in every form of nature that we see. So it's all, however, as sensitive spiritual beings having a human experience, we are aware that we are what we eat. So when we choose not to eat flesh and not to eat other animals, living creatures, living beings, and preferring to eat nuts and the bounty of nature, or if necessary, the fruit and vegetables or whatever, which would otherwise not normally be used, we are then cooperating with nature to engender more life. So the crucial part of the understanding of all traditional societies, to my mind, is that life engenders life. Because even even if one imagines the beneficence of the divine, helplessly, joyously creating myriad forms of life, I mean, this is my personal belief. But the method of being does not involve any consideration of a deity as such. It only requires one to discover oneself within the framework of what one is existing in, which is nature. So understanding nature, understanding oneself, understand by ritual practices, by vocational practices, by practice makes perfect, thinking of that whatever your discipline is, the creator is the ultimate sculptor, the ultimate artist, the ultimate architect. And then in practicing your traditional vocation, whatever it may, you are trying to approach the mind of God by practicing the principles behind the particular tradition that you are practicing. This is the essential knowledge of the tradition, of the indigenous knowledge, which is what we have turned away from today. And all of these, the capacity of human beings, like, one thing you said that I found a little bit difficult to accept, in the sense that you are 100% correct, but there is the idea that you are coming from a settler colonizing culture, and that you have, and even this, I mean, certain sense, the word indigenous is being used in a kind of like with this kind of racial connotation, like it's about a tribe, a particular tribe having, the common ethnic groups. Even in the way we are applying it, even while we are calling it a universal term, we are still defining it slightly in terms of whether we are personally indigenous or not. The point is, I think the point really that Chandra has been trying to point out, and I think which he harks back to the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People, is that we are all indigenous to this planet. We are not, everything is in this place. I mean, one of the arguments one might even say about, I know that one of my teachers, Mudyan Setendakun, thought that, that even if a bomb went off in an airport, like when it happened in Sri Lanka, when the terrorists bombed the airplanes, he said even that is an act of nature. He said human beings are part of nature. So when human beings do absurd things, that's also part of nature doing something. You can't say it's not. I mean, of course, that also harks into the Advaita tradition and things like that, but that's also a little complicated. And I don't think that the modern exponents of Advaitism really understand what they're talking about at all. But that's a different issue. But anyway, but I really enjoyed your paper, and I really enjoyed talking to you. And I'm so glad that. But I mean, what I'm saying is, what I was trying to say is, don't. I don't feel you have to be apologize for being who you are. You can't help for being who you are. So just that should not even come up as an issue anymore in your mind. You're trying to be human, and we're all trying to be human. I mean, the tree knows how to be a tree, a bird knows how to be a bird, but us, unfortunately, us human beings have forgotten how to be human. And that's, I think, where we're stuck at. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Feisal. Shannon, would you like to share your comments to that, what Feisal said?
Just a brief comment, Feisal. I so appreciate what you shared for many reasons, but you're coming directly from a tradition, which is one that I have attempted to study in my own ways from afar. And you've clearly integrated, you've clearly lived the knowledge of that tradition. I can hear that in your words, and I look forward to experiencing more of your perspectives in the future. And what you said about the way I heard it was giving myself permission not to apologize for being who I am, for being a human being. You probably could hear that in my story, that there is still some of that apology. And I think if there is that bit left in me, how much more is there in everyone else, people like me? And I appreciate that message so much, to just say we don't have to apologize for being human. And if you don't mind, it's something I would like to take from you and share forward with other people in conversation. I think it's very important. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Feisal and Shannon. I had planned this for a 2-hour session, and even 2 hours seem, way too short to do justice to all the perspectives and nuances being shared. So I'll straight away, as the moderator of the session, move to some of the very, what I would call tangible aspects of being indigenous. And what I also shared, yeah, Darryl, please.
Yes, Chandra, thank you. I would like to, share my
Sure, you're most welcome.
my perspectives, and I'm taking it from the point where, straight from the point of Shannon's deepest point of narration was that lady who was at the corner of the room, who was the indigenous person, standing on her land, and she had to say to all in the room, and that we are all indigenous, making space for the acceptance of white person Shannon over there, giving her space to feel that it is okay, and that she's not at fault, and she's accepted, and she's welcomed to that space, without that lady feeling that she's an outsider, because that lady had the wisdom to understand that it's most probably not Shannon's fault that she has landed here. It was some of her ancestors who, for certain reasons, they migrated here to this land. And Shannon and her family, whether it's her generation, a generation after her, before her, that they just found themselves in their place. So the question is, that's what Shannon asks, would be asking herself, am I to blame that I am here? Certainly not, right? But that I am here, I would like to be a good human being, and that's in my spirit, and I would like to do that. And so the point, what I really pick up from Shannon, and I think that's the right, approach, is to have this conversation get bigger, and go across the globe, because it's a conversation about compassion. It's a conversation about people who are indigenous to a land, not finding fault with some people who are not of the indigenous color, and who do not have their accent, or who do not have their uh, behaviors, or cultural practices. Um, and so if we go deeper into this, and it's coming to what we were doing in the Earth Keepers movement, and even at the starting few slides, of our video Making New Earth, where I have talked about the last 200 years, and about certain people, we call them, the capitalists, who started trading and doing merchandising, and they had certain vested interests to go to other lands. That's how, in fact, the East India Company came into India in the guise of trade. And after a few years, they came as the British rule to, completely demolish India, who had 30% of GDP. By the time of the world, by the time they left, we were 2% of GDP. So, yeah, so what I'm saying is that people would have come for different reasons, and because we finally want closure, right? Even if somebody's saying, okay, I'm not at fault, because and the indigenous person accepts you, yes, you're not at fault, you're one with us, and if you'd like to blend with our culture, here are our open arms. And but if somebody wants to go to the past and try to find, where the problem started, rather than with people, I think we have to find the behavior, of what happened at that time. And the only reason to go into history and to bring it up again is so that we do not repeat that kind of behavior in the future again, you know. So, and that's with our expanding, energy of consciousness now, these dialogues should open that there is no need to colonize another area for the sake of, capturing resources. And if we have a population, we have certain things in our tradition that, our God has never told us to limit our number of children. And so people may bring it in different disguises, right? but then we have to have a common dialogue. Yes, let us all agree that there is a certain behavior or certain thing that we can agree to. And uh, so, so in terms of, I think the starting point is that question, because if you don't ask that question, there is no opening ground for that compassion. So I feel that's the first dialogue where you bring to the table. Otherwise, if you don't bring this compassion to the table, then people are just at that starting point. Like you are from somewhere else. You are what you are, and I am what I am. And the two never meet, and they never crisscross, and they never merge. So I think this is a great time in this planet, on this planet, for us to have this conversation and to visit those aspects, and I think there are 2 points here. One is to see the earlier thing about certain attitudes of colonization that happened, that we should say agree to now, that we do not go ahead with that behavior. And even if you are now on a new land, uh, that we should start respecting nature, right? What is the acceptance of somebody who's from another land to an indigenous person? And if that dialogue opens, and the dialogue is about we are here to respect the natural resources of this land, the natural flora, fauna, the animals. We are here to understand how we can live a low carbon footprint life, and especially how not to damage the environment. This was my talk at the Third World Parliament on spirituality, dharma, and the earth keepers. So that is the duty of every human being, from the time you were born to the time you die, of maintaining this organic ecosystem, which modern civilization and all of what we call innovation and science has damaged all of that. And so again, coming back to this video, that I would really love Shannon, later to watch this video, because it talks about the mindset, the certain capitalists, and how they went across the world. And so now with the pandemic and all coming up, we have seen the roots of the British Empire also, and how that started, how it went from Britain, how it went underground into the United States as well, certain factions of those people, and what has transpired since then. So the point I'm trying to make finally is that in that entire movement also, in our video, it is shown that how they created these cities by damming rivers and choking up the water downstream, and how villages slowly died. And by this dams, they started piping water into cities and started creating these control zones over the last 200 years. And once they had people in a control zone, they started teaching a new version of what is God, what is nature, which separated the people from their roots. So this whole civilization on our planet, whoever is living in any kind of city, metro city, we have been disconnected for 2-3 generations from the meaning of nature, from being connected with nature, from the indigenous habits. And it's mainly I see this kind of isolation, where they have taught us through textbooks and videos, and writings, the meaning of God. And so we've got all these different versions of God that are at conflict with the indigenous, real life experience of spirit, or great spirit, and God. And in that video, I've also talked about all the indigenous people in the world before all of this, capitalist movement started. Um, their meaning of God was the same, because they lived on the land and they were experiencing God in real time in all manifestation. And so whether you read the Red Indian manuscripts of what's the meaning of God, that God is great spirit, all around us, out of which all comes, out of and into which all goes, you will see that similar dialogues are there with the Aboriginals, with the other people across the planet, and the Mayans, and the plant medicine people. So finally, as this conversation opens, I hope that it goes finally down and it brings on the table and takes us to those places that certain kinds of behaviors have caused this damage to the planet, and we should not repeat this again. And wherever we are, let us find those organic roots that actually bind us and build our future. That means, with the natural law and with the plants and stuff, what we are doing in our entire movement of, green, circular, local economy, asset-based community development. So I see this, as a great fusion of our keepers movement and the conversation that Shannon brings to the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darryl, for illuminating and really kind of widening the canvas of the indigenous discourse.
Thank you. Can I say something?
Yeah, Lindelwa, I'm just coming to you. I'm just
Okay.
just give me. I'll share an introduction. So Lindelwa comes from South Africa, which in the narrative that we are kind of building is the southernmost tip of the global South. So it's not just about the construct of indigenous and non-indigenous, first world and third world, developed and developing. It's also about the global North and global South. And in that, what has happened in South Africa is very interesting. And while Lindelwa asks a question with respect to what Shannon has shared, I'd like to bring to everyone's attention how the indigenous card was played very willfully by the fascist forces to inject European fascism into the Zulu tribe's indigenous identity in projecting Jacob Zuma, a very corrupt leader, but portrayed as a son of the soil by a bunch of crooked industrialists who are now in jail. So it's again a tectonic shift that, when we talk about the yang aspects, the harder aspects. Welcome, Lindelwa. It's such a pleasure to have you on board. She's a young indigenous activist from South Africa, and she comes here through reference of our good friend Maseko Menzi from the Institute of Africology. Lindelwa, please go ahead with your question and comments.
Thank you so much, Sensei. Just to say that
could you please share your video if possible?
Right, let me try. Oh, there you go. The lighting is not very good, but I hope you can all see me. Yes? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Shannon, for your presentation. I think our professor, who's the director of Center for Indigenous Studies, would have been very pleased and happy to be here to engage with you even more about this, because these last couple of weeks, the theme, the topic of discussion has been about the fact that indigenous knowledge systems are not only African traditional systems, because here in South Africa, yes, so whenever we're thinking about indigenous knowledge systems, we always relate them to African culture. We've been, I don't know if, my internet is a bit unstable, which is the reason why I had my video switched off. But
I think it's okay. Why don't you turn your video off and then we can be sure and hear what you said. Yeah, please. Yeah,
okay.
If that's okay, Chandra.
Okay,
sure.
Cool. Right, thank you. So yes, as I was saying, that here in South Africa, when you talk about the indigenous knowledge systems and practices, we tend to associate them with African traditions, or the Zulu traditions, or the Tswana Xhosa traditions, but other cultures are not necessarily perceived as being indigenous. I guess for the same reason that you mentioned, that because they're not native, like in Africa or in South Africa per se. So what we've been trying to do is to get people to understand and be much more open-minded with regard to the fact that in a way, we are all indigenous, like you're saying, that everybody has got their own indigenous cultures, and we've been trying to create spaces where different cultures, like Indian cultures or Chinese cultures and all of that, can come together and explore and talk about what it means for them to be indigenous, even though they are far away from their native lands, so to speak. Yeah, but again, the conversation, it's still a very, the space itself is still very contentious, because people have the sense that the reason why there's such an emphasis on indigenous systems or promoting them, especially here in South Africa, it's because for the longest time, when the apartheid system was in control, African people were not allowed to practice their, their traditional systems or their traditional practices. There were laws that were banning, for example, like traditional healing and other traditional practices. So it was only after democracy that people were then able to practice some of these healing and traditional rituals openly. So we're at a phase where we're trying to rescue or reenact our traditions and our cultures. So the challenge that we're experiencing with most people who are still claiming very much that indigenous should be mostly and solely related to traditional African cultures, it's that they feel like most of the spaces that exist are dominated by like Eurocentric practices, or wise, if you could call it. So they want to create spaces where, just like Mansoor was saying, where they can find themselves, where they can find their identity, where they can learn to be like their true selves, their true nature. And the danger of allowing someone from a different culture like yourself perhaps to come into those spaces is that, again, it would disrupt the process of people to actually understand themselves in their own way, in their own spaces. And again, it's a matter of creating safe spaces and spaces where they can find some sorts of belonging, because even though we are in South Africa, and most of these cultures, these traditional cultures are native and indigenous in South Africa, we have been displaced by colonialism and apartheid in our case. So that sense of connecting with yourself, with your environment, and really revering in your own spiritual beliefs even hasn't been afforded to the majority of our people. So people are then saying, it's okay, we understand that everybody has different, everybody is indigenous, but what we're saying is, can we be allowed to do this in our own way without then now having to accommodate others, to come into this space? And again, you did touch a bit on appropriation, that there's the danger of that as well, because like with our Zulu traditions, we have white people who have become sangomas now, so and it's okay and it's allowed, because one of our principles is ubuntu, and we're all about humanity, we're all about opening ourselves up so that others can learn from us, and if they feel like they want to be part of us, then it's fine. But the problem with that is that what happens when a Black child sees a white sangoma? Like, how are they supposed to see themselves and know themselves and grow in their own, culture? So that is one of the challenges that some of the people that I work with bringing to the table, because it's not a matter of not necessarily
Yeah, I think we've just lost Lindelwa.
is a child of
So,
soil. Yeah. Sorry, just to finish though, but at the same time, I do think it's important for us to have these conversations because we are working towards a united and collective global, community, and the fact that people like Shannon are realizing their own connection with the world, with the planet, and they're trying to do something about it. It's okay. But going back to what Darryl was saying, that it is about the behavior and making sure that you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And when you come into a space, have that respect and that understanding of the reason why those spaces were created and how you can contribute into making it a much more pleasant and fruitful environment for the people that really need it, and ensure that it's not just about getting accreditation for this or credit for that, but yeah, give the people that didn't have the opportunities before to be able to also have something of their own that they can be proud of, and also feather, into something better and greater. Sorry, thank you. But I really do appreciate what you are doing, and yeah, there's a lot that needs to be explored. Thank you.
thank you so much, Lindelwa, for so beautifully bringing out the facets of how apartheid had kind of subdued the voices of indigenous people, and that had really subverted their ability to create spaces where they could speak out and reach out to not just their own community but to the world at large. So that is what, as I shared in the chat, in the comment, it should be the new focus of the Global South. As now that I would really credit Shannon for kind of breaking the ice on this very tricky, treacherous issue by and large. And why tricky and treacherous, and why I would like to move into the first part, as I had planned the structure for today's session, about the yin
Chandra,
and yang.
you have so much you want to cover in this call, don't you?
Yeah,
and yeah, I would
but
really,
Shannon,
I would
I'm not
love to have
only,
the chance.
but I'm not only better informed, but I'm wiser, with all the perspectives shared from all our participants, to go on a slow discourse. So, like slow food movement, we need a slow discourse movement. So I'm not, sticking to my structure.
Wonderful.
I would like to let it flow, and yet bring in some method into the conversation, so that people who watch it later do not find it too spread out, or so I'm just trying to keep the balance. So coming to the very specific question of the yin and yang, the first part, you beautifully explained the yin aspects of the psychology of spirituality and culture. But as I shared in the note, it mirrors the hard realities, the yang of the development, growth, and progress narratives. And they had enough attraction to move and sway, the best of leaders that even the Global South had to offer, from a Nehru to a Suharto to even the Yugoslavia president, and even Latin America to a great extent, because it created its own bubbles and it kind of crowded out the space for other perspectives to exist. So it kind of, really encroached upon through its dialectics of, firstly, what was brought by Christianity as the civilized and the savage, that had lots of traction. So how it created upward mobility trap for certain sections of the, subjects and slaves. Next was the dialectic of, capitalism and communism, which are actually two sides of the same coin. I mean, there's hardly anything to distinguish between capitalism and communism. They're both anthropocentric. They're both against nature. They're both non-indigenous. But somehow, if you look at the political formations in every country almost across the globe, it's split into left and right, capitalists and communists, conservatives and liberals. So the yang aspects of how non-indigenous character has been hard drilled into the systems and structures of politics, of science and technology, of our education systems, of our healthcare systems, of our farming, agriculture, industry, every aspect of our lives. So unless we see the mirror of how the psychology, spirituality, and culture mirrors the hard aspects of the trespassing into the indigenous political systems by calling all kings as corrupt and all kings as, some kind of, loose moral characters, that, falls against the evidence of kings being frugal, kings, sacrificing themselves for their people, kings, really living up to the duty to dharma, and all the empirical evidence of the majoritarian democracy, the ballot democracy. It's been made so sacrosanct that there's no space to even question that and explore alternative political systems which may be indigenous. Similarly, where is the space for, indigenous science and technology, the inquiry, the methodologies? So I'll just give you a recent example where I had lots of struggle with people who otherwise are such great support, at World Council for Health. But their Better Way conference was called Reclaiming the Science. And somehow I couldn't, come to terms with how without reclaiming humanity, we can reclaim science. Because science is so much, kind of colored in the non-indigenous mindset. It's viewed so much from the non-indigenous lens. Its methodologies, its clinical trials. So all that put together, and what Darryl has also been, kind of highlighting through his integrative medicine practice. Same way in our industry, in our career planning. I mean, all said and done, at the end of the day, we are trapped into using the money system, which is the fiat currency, which is the biggest weapon in the hands of the non-indigenous, dehumanizing, despiritualizing forces. But we are so helpless to unplug from the money system because it threatens our existence, our very survival. So it requires indigenous to really, break out of the, the cocoons that it's been kind of, straight-jacketed into, of being only tribal, being only folk, being localized, connecting to the land, and leaving out the space for globalist interventions. The New World Order is a handiwork of World Economic Forum, as if the old world order belongs to the indigenous. Not true. Even the old world order, what we want to replace, is so cleverly, so treacherously controlled and manipulated by the same forces who we credit for the new world order terminology. And we are now fighting amongst ourselves whether there should be a NWO or not. So anybody who talks about globalist interventions or talks about a new world order, because the old world order is non-indigenous totalitarianism and Faustian. It has sold its soul to the devil. So Shannon, my question to you and also to all the panelists is that the yin part is perhaps easier to travel. But when it comes to the yang part, it requires lots of rigorous planning, lots of deep dive thinking into multidisciplinary aspects of the world as we are faced with today. So how do you think your learnings, your experiences from negotiating with the softer aspects, the yin aspects, can be useful to make transformational or transcendental changes in the yang of being indigenous?
Thank you, Chandra. That is a huge question. And I will share some ideas briefly. I'd love to hear from other people as well. And I did want to respond back to the comments that Darryl made and Lindelwa also. And I think that I can respond to those while at the same time answering to your question, Chandra. I hope that I can. First of all, Darryl, I will watch the video that you recommended, and I look forward to doing so. And just to frame my answer, well, and let me respond to Lindelwa and Darryl as well in framing this. So, Lindelwa, what you said about your story was quite touching in that you are expressing the recognition that when those outside cultures come in, let me see how I want to say this. So wake up human, when I talk about wake up human, I'm not talking about waking up into a spiritual expansion outside of the body or outside of our day-to-day lives, outside of the world. And some people in my culture think of waking up as that, waking up out of the life of nature. And the way that I'm viewing waking up with this project, Wake Up Human, is a waking up back into connection, a waking up back into conversation with nature, as I've expressed. And so when I hear your story, Lindelwa, about the concerns that your people have, you're still struggling to recapture the ability to practice your own traditions. And here there are people coming from the outside and longing to find traditions, and therefore perhaps encroaching on your ability to in this very tender place, recapture your traditions, your rituals, and to be able to practice those openly, which is so beautiful and so important. And so what I recommend to people from my own background, and what I hope to expand into this recommendation, respecting what Darryl said about, we don't want to just go back into the past and rehash the past. So I would say that in particular for European settler colonialists, and I imagine this is true for South African European settler colonialists as well, that there is a very rich potential in going backward in time, because it allows us to remember, to work to find those ancient roots, those ancient historical roots that we come from, in order that we cease to try to incorporate these fragile re-emerging indigenous traditions I think we should cease to try to incorporate those for the time being. It's a matter of respect, allowing the traditions of South Africa, allowing the native traditions of the United States to regain their voices. And so to the extent that we can have a historical view, then we can find our own sources of connection. Now, I think this is related to, so I appreciated both of you very much what you shared, and I would love to have further conversations from your perspectives. And then so taking this back to Chandra, your question about yin and yang. So I will speak from my own perspective and from this perspective of being uprooted. You know, we've been uprooted by our own we white Eurocentric Americans, and we have been uprooted by this modern Western worldview in the same way that everyone on the planet has been. And one of the things that I've recognized has happened in this process is related to yin and yang. So in my mind, as you mentioned, so much of the world looking through a lens of science and materialism and scientific proofs. This is a very yang type of world. And I say this respectfully, I am not a Taoist. And so I'm using these terms in a yin and yang, in a layman's, from a layman's point of view, laywoman's point of view, but living in this very yang world. And this practice of going back into our ancient roots for people who have lost them or forgotten them, what I'm finding is that is also often a practice of reconnecting to the yin, where these cultures have demoted the feminine in importance, subjected subjected isn't the right word, but have submerged the feminine beneath the masculine as something of lesser importance or perhaps of no importance. And I've written on this as well, the phenomenon of people growing up in American culture that lesser value. I'm not a woman talking about the feminine and masculine within us, so that the feminine can be pushed down, and we have people, many people, who have forgotten to listen to our intuition, who may not even believe that intuition is real, who have forgotten the value of tending to land, community, and conservation, and children, and many of the things that the feminine point of view embraces. And so when I attempt to answer your question, Chandra, about, you know, how can we take what we've learned from yin and utilize that in an attempt to create a more integrated experience in a relationship to yang, I must say, I think that there's more work that needs to be done on reclaiming the power of the yin, because right now we're so imbalanced to one side that I think if we were to try to work toward healing through the yang at this point, we may be using the broken tools to try to fix the broken system. Whereas to the extent that we might be able to cultivate the respect and the power of the feminine, then we can perhaps come back into a more of a balanced perspective. And then we have some of that feminine lens, some of that yin lens that we can then use to approach the yang systems and structures in a much more holistic way. So those are my initial thoughts. I think I could go much deeper with this, but let me leave it at that and see if anyone else has something to add.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd now, kind of add more layers to the yin and yang. So one is to kind of learn from the yin and still assume that yang is another compartment. So you transfer the tools and the learnings to, make the desirable changes in the yang. The other deeper layer is to look at the yin as a mirror of the yang, and also the reality that the colonialist literature, its philosophy, its social sciences, also very cleverly assert the yin. For example, they talk about women empowerment. They talk a lot about compassion through eliminating hunger. So first, in the first place, they create hunger, they create starvation, and then they take the high moral ground of making zero hunger as their goal, and no one can question them for that. So this kind of inception of lies and hoaxes requires delving deeper into the psyche, into the consciousness, and when we want to dive into the deeper simplicities where we want to kind of be on the same page or on the same wavelength. So coming to the last 15 minutes, I would not like to extend the session beyond 2 hours. So my suggestion moving forward is to allow ourselves more time to create a coherent, cogent narrative for what we agree upon, and to bring our difference in. So my suggestion moving forward is that let us split the 3-part structure that I had suggested at the beginning of today's session into 3 sessions itself. So today, I think we have delved at some length on the yin and yang issue, but I won't say we have covered more than even 1/3 of what I would like to, kind of lead the conversation towards, to levels of deeper simplicity. So before it faces another outage, I would like to invite all of you to one of the locations that may be mutually convenient for us. It could be the Feisal Mansoor's place in Sri Lanka. It could be Maseko Menzi's Institute of Africology. It could be Darryl's Earthkeepers Connect, haven with all the organic farming and permaculture spaces. Or it could be at Shannon's Denver, Colorado presence, or where I'm at present. And I'm not kind of undermining that. It almost feels like heaven. So I'll anyway switch off the video if that helps. So I'd like to now invite Menzi Maseko, who's just joined in, to just briefly introduce. He's also a integrative traditional medicine practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and one of the co-founders of Institute of Africology. Menzi Maseko,
greetings,
are you listening?
Greetings, everyone. Yes. Greetings, everybody.
Welcome.
My deepest apology. Apologies for arriving late. Very. It's more than late, in fact. Excuse me for that, Darryl and Chandra and everyone. I've been writing an assessment. I'm writing an exam, and I took a 5-minute nap, which turned into something else. The dream world pulled me in. I would call myself a voracious dreamer. I dream too much. So I had set a time for this. I even invited my sister Lindelwa, who we work with in the Center for the Academy for Contextual Wellbeing. And I'm glad she is here. Long story short, I'm in South Africa. I'm from KwaZulu in Durban. but I live in Gauteng, in a province now, the economic hub of South Africa. I'm living here for economic reasons, but the heart is still in KZN. And as Baba Chandra has already explained, I'm one of the co-founders of the Institute of Africology, which is still based in KZN, and it's got a school there, a resource center, which is growing. We want to make it into an actual a school, but it does a lot of outreach into the community. There's a lot of community work that is done there, but mostly its main focus is teaching the youth, grounding their youth in their identity. Some people may look at it as like just identity politics, but if you look at it in the context of Southern Africa especially, there's been a lot of erasure of people's indigenous, how can I say, the indigenous cultures. The wealth of our culture has been removed from us through imperialism and colonization. So Institute of Africology uses what in Ghana they would call it a Sankofa kind of approach, which basically means go back and fetch it. Whatever worked for the indigenous people and it worked for the earth and worked cosmologically, we must bring back those things and make them work and serve us in the environment today. So there's a whole lot of environmental activism. There's a lot of historical teachings, raising up, basically giving a new curriculum to students and learners, that things that they don't get in school, because our schools may be, we may be living in an independent era in terms of politically, but the system that we, whether it's a financial system, whether it's an educational system, it's still very colonial in nature. African history is taught in a very, how can I say, it's still, we use the word anti-Black, so it does not give the African child any value in their history. Our history, basically, according to this educational system, begins at begins with the, how can I say, at that confluence of civilizations where we were colonized. Before that, we are basically depicted as savages. But Institute of Africology does a whole lot of work to uncover the history and to show the cultural unity of all of Africa and the things that we have done and the things that we can still do. There was something that someone said, I don't think it was Chandra, it was Shannon. As I'm introducing myself, I'm sorry. There's there's something that Shannon said, which reminded me. She was talking about the divine, about the feminine, centering the feminine in the conversation about indigenization and about moving forward in the post-COVID world. She mentioned something that reminded me of an African feminist, an African-American feminist, Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, she said something like this. She said, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. So when Shannon said something about finding new ways of recalibrating our civilization and all that, I somehow immediately I thought of Audre Lorde, the master's statement that it's actually a little booklet called "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," which calls for a new way, a new approach, a new consciousness. Lastly, I am a Chief Knowledge Officer at an organization called Green Ink Works. So I'm a translator. I do a lot of translation for a lot of different organizations and some communications services for those organizations, focusing a lot also on environmental justice, making sure that organizations that I work with, that I consult, have a very keen eye on the environmental impact of whatever projects that we embark on. A lot of organizations believe that because they are not industrial organizations, they are not, they are actually not, what's the word? They don't have a hand in the destruction of the environment. And well, in the impact, they think that the impact in the environment is environmental degradation is very little. But then I believe that in our organization, we believe that there's a cumulative effect to everything. So each individual and each family and each community's actions are very important. We have to be conscious of the environment, preserving the water, preserving the forest, and preserving especially, and lastly, let me say this lastly, in another organization that I work with called Ikambi, Natural Healing, we focus strictly on the traditional healers, connecting the traditional healer to the policies, to the legislation, to the emerging sciences that connect our indigenous practices to what is actually happening today. Because a whole lot of traditional, I'll be honest with you, with a lot of traditional healers, a lot of the time, not that they're insular, but they are so busy, they are so busy in their community that most of the time they hardly pay attention to what is happening around them that may affect them. They pay no attention to issues of conservation. A lot of them, they pay no attention to issues of legislation and policies that are made for them by people sometimes that masquerade as their representatives, especially in government or in whatever forms of authority. So bills are passed that touch the traditional healer, but the traditional healer is not involved. Policies are made, and a few voices, when people do the research, a few voices are highlighted, but the real traditional healer who does this every day is not really involved. So in Ikambi, we try to get the traditional healer and the indigenous knowledge keeper, we try to get those people to find themselves in the center of the conversation, so that as things progress or regress, they must know their agency. So that's the space that I find myself in right now. And yeah, and we are here doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maseko. So wonderful to listen to such deep dive perspectives affecting our healthcare, our education, how African and so do maybe South American children or Indian children are being denied the transparent and fair representation of their own history, and thus what is fed into their mind is what comes out as function, as their thought process, as their preferences and choices that they make. The same also applies for, we should not forget to mention, to judiciary. I mean, judicial systems in most part of the world do not follow the indigenous templates of building consensus, or of they follow a more evidence-based trial approach of which is so prejudiced against the the downtrodden or the the underprivileged, because it's all about money. You pay the lawyers money, and money changes hands, and court rulings get affected. So coming to the end of this session, what I'd like to suggest, and I'd like to listen to all of you, is that can we make it as a series with the same agenda note, the 3 parts as I shared at the beginning of this session, into session every Sunday and Wednesday. So this also gives us 2 to 3 days to kind of reflect and introspect over whatever is being said, and come up with fresh perspectives and building the narrative towards a mass formation. So I think the ultimate resolution to my mind is very unambiguous, is that we need a mass formation bigger than the colonial setup in whatever fashion, disguised or covert or overt, that they may exist today. Without doing that, we will not have our indigenous education system, will not have our indigenous healthcare system, will not have our indigenous political, socio-economic, judicial systems, and even cultural systems, because the moment you see money changing hands, what is being shown in television serials or what is being shown as 24/7 news is all colored. It's all planted propaganda. So if we want to extricate ourselves from this trap, we will need to get lots more brave, lots more bolder and radical, and what I like to call outrageous, so audaciously outrageous, to question each and every aspect of how deeply pervasive and all-encompassing the non-indigenous systems and structures have become. I don't want to kind of, make it sound very, kind of, up against a wall. I think there is a view of looking at the chinks in the armor. What we hear about the David and Goliath in numerous stories of when things get big and monstrous, one way to look at them is that they're too big to be defeated. The other view is to say that, and to see that they are too big to miss. So on that note, I'd like to thank all the participants and bring this session to a conclusion and continue with the same speakers and with new speakers from different parts of the world, from East Asia particularly, which is one of the most populous regions. So we have one good speaker, Wang Li, introduced by Feisal Mansoor, who we would like to invite for the next session on 15th, that is Wednesday. And hopefully the timing would remain same, 8 p.m. India time, but we will need to juggle it to bring in, geographical regions which are to the east of India, which would find it late in the night. So we'll just see how we can, maybe sometimes juggle with the timings, but the dates will remain constantly Sundays and Wednesdays. And we'll keep you prior informed as we speak to various speakers. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. It was so engaging and thought-provoking. Now, I think we are making good headways, and we will, like we say, even a 1,000-mile journey starts with the first step. I think we have taken a few big strides through conversations that we have had so far and in today's session, and we'll keep getting there and lead towards a healthy, harmonious, peaceful, and prosperous world order in the spirit of we are all indigenous. Thank you so much. Namaste, greetings.
Thank you.
And if anybody would like to share any last comments, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Chandra. Thanks so much for the invitation. A real pleasure and an honor to be amongst all of you, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Menzi. See you all next time.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, it was very interesting conversation today, and more wide-ranging and more direct, more directed than it can sometimes be. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone. This was good. Very
Namaste.
fruitful, informative.
Okay.
Namaste.
Namaste, Lindelwa.
Namaste, Lindelwa.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.